Now, I say this because I benefited hugely from the insights and the personal conversations with these global leaders, and the consequence of such discussions not only just happened back in 1985, they continue to impress me till today, because as a result of my foreign ministry experience, as well as my subsequent educational and working experience, I have known all the US presidents or former presidents since Nixon, with two exceptions. I've never met with former President Gerald Ford, but he graduated from Yale Law School, so we were alumni with each other. And I corresponded with President Ford, even though we never met. Now, the other one is President Donald Trump. I've never met him. Whether I want to meet him or not, that's another issue. So I think the fact that I've met with all these presidents when they were either incumbent president or former president in different capacities, of course, since President Nixon, really gives me enough solid information when I talk about the United States as a country, talk about the US government as a political system, talk about President Donald Trump as a president, or the more recent President Biden. We met him in the 1980s when he was a Senate Democratic leader. At that time, he was nowhere near the very top of the US leadership, but that gave me the first impression of Joe Biden, and it led to subsequently he becoming a vice president for 8 years and president of the United States for 4 years. Now, the advantage for me is that based on all these personal encounters and relations with different leaders in China, in the United States, elsewhere, in many other countries, and also based on my very intense reading and studying and very high level of education at Yale, for example, especially at Yale Law School, I think I'm a person in the know, and I always want to update my knowledge base about what's happening in the world, including, for example, about the ironclad brotherhood between China and Pakistan, as well as the need to build peace and stability on the Indian subcontinent, and the absolute necessity of stopping any country to weaponize water in the Indus River, for example. And I think I never make a comment out of the blue or in a vacuum. I always put a comment of mine in a historical context, meaning I have tremendous amount of responsibility when I make a comment in the public media, because the worst I can do is to mislead anyone or any country. And the best I can do is to make a positive impact, either by clarifying a particular issue or explaining a particular issue for different audiences with the aim of building up peace and opposing war.
Professor Victor Gao, it's always very mesmerizing listening to you. Um, uh, as you said, as you mentioned Donald Trump and your history with indulging with the elites of the world, how do you see America's, US and China's relationship from 80s till now? Is it on a downward trajectory? Was it on an upward trajectory? Uh, is it going up and down with the presidencies changing through time in America? How do you see this?
Well, there are several comments I can make. One is that President Trump, who is the president, the commander in chief of the military forces in the United States, who needs due recognition as respect as the president of the United States, is a very extraordinary, a very unusual president in historical terms. When I worked with former President Nixon, President Reagan at that time, and Vice President George H.W. Bush, who later became the president, and when I worked with Clinton, when he was still running for the presidency, and we went to the same Yale Law School. So after he retired from the White House, we met again for quite a few days in Beijing. And when I met with, for example, George W. Bush when we met in international occasions as well as in Washington, D.C., and with O- President Obama in Kuala Lumpur during one of the ASEAN uh, summit meeting over there. I think I never could have expected that there will be a president like President Donald Trump. But that decision is made by the American people, and they deserve whatever kind of president that they have chosen. So we need to deal with that with a lot of humiliation and also high level of responsibility. I would say China-US relations are at the worst period ever since 1971 when Dr. Henry Kissinger made a secret visit and when President Richard Nixon made a historic state visit to China in 1972, and when Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping and U.S. President Jimmy Carter normalized relations in 1979, and then during all the subsequent years, presidents, except Joe Biden, all visited China when they were incumbent US presidents. So you can see China US relations started from zero, from scratch, went up all the way to the height, and paved the way for the end of the Cold War and really brought tremendous amount of wealth to China as a nation, as well as to the United States. And the two countries became highly intertwined with each other. And by now, the United States and China are the two largest economies in the world. And China is larger than the United States if we use purchasing power parity as the benchmark. And China is much larger than the United States for a whole range of products. We have a list. It's more than 200 major items, including, for example, iron and steel, automobile production, you name it. And I think China wants to deal with the United States as a peer, as a partner, and China has no desire at all to impose its political system or ideology on the United States. But the United States probably is suffering from two nightmares. They worry that China will surpass the United States. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned, China is already much larger than the United States in multiple ways. And then the second nightmare suffered by the United States may be even worse. They worry that once China is larger than the United States, China may impose its views, its values, its political system, its ideology on the United States, marginalizing the United States, pushing the United States away from the center of the global stage. Now, China will never do that. Why? Because China always respects all the other countries and treats all the other countries, big or small, as equal, rather than trying to dominate above any country, big or small. So, in that sense, I hope Washington will really become more sensible and will have enough rationality and wisdom to recognize that China is a megatrend in the world of today, and you need to get along with China despite of our differences. And then war should not be considered as an option. And please believe in what Victor Gao, has been talking about. That is the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. In that context, while I'm very pessimistic about the status of China-US relations today, for the medium term and for the longer term, I'm very optimistic because I truly believe in the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. And whatever ups and downs Washington is going through, all the traumas and the sufferings, for example, they are going through, eventually they need to come back to their senses. They will need to recognize that China is a megatrend in the world, and to weaponize against China is not in the fundamental interest of the United States. So, in a matter of, let's say, 10 years from now, 25 years from now, I think the United States will be more and more accustomed to the fact that the United States and China need to get along with each other. And jointly, China and the United States can really make great contribution to peace and development and stability in the world.
Sir, how do you look at the US China relationship by the end of Trump's term, this term? Would it survive this, or damage has been done, or more damage can be done in this relationship while Trump is in office?
Well, first of all, there are still a little bit more than 3 years before the end of the Trump administration 2.0. Secondly, nobody knows what President Trump will or will not do during the coming 3 years or so. And thirdly, I think whatever he wants to do may be limited by several things. One is that China will always stand firm to defend its legitimate rights, especially protecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and will not allow any country to push China around or to force its ultimatum onto China. That's number one. Number two is that China is not what some Americans say they want to uh, treat China as risk, de-risk China. No, it's not possible. China is a combination of both opportunities and risks. And if anyone wants to de-risk something, fire him right away because you cannot de-risk. You need to engage with risk and manage risk. So I think de-risking between China and the United States is not possible, and Trump will need to realize that. So he need to eventually get along with China and try to view China as a combination of opportunities and risks. Secondly, I think President Trump eventually, sooner rather than later, will realize that the might of the United States is actually not unlimited. It's very much limited. For example, in terms of the rare earth, the United States hugely depend on Chinese support of rare earth for its national defense industry. If the United States wants to fight against China in terms of the tariff war, and China retaliates by denying any iota of rare earth materials to the United States, I'm afraid the US defense industry will need to grind to a halt. Can you believe it? And that may not be good for the US national security or the fundamental interests of the American people. Now, on the other hand, for example, Trump is very eager to fight this trade war against China, as well as against many other countries in the world. But allow me to mention the war is the wrong war to fight. Why? Because President Trump, even today, cannot have enough courage to tell the American people that it will be the American people who will pay all these tariffs. And eventually, for the American people to pay the tariff, which is a kind of tax against the American people, it's not going to make America great again or make American people wealthy again. It is completely absurd to believe that these tariffs will be paid by other countries. No, the reality is that the American people will need to pay. So I think while China US relations are in a roller coaster, very dangerous mode right now, please have enough confidence because I think the United States need to realize that if they want to pick a war with China, pick a fight with China, they will not win. Conventional war or nuclear war, they will not win. If they want to impose a nuclear war on China, both China and the United States will be destroyed. And if they really want to de risk China or to decouple China, the American people will be made worse off rather than better off. So I think China is very steady right now. China refuses to be agitated by all this maximum pressure from the United States because China has enough wherewithal to fight back against the United States if they continue on to pick a fight with China. And eventually, I think sanity will need to prevail in Washington. And what President Trump is doing is probably exactly the overreach that Professor Paul Kennedy wrote about in his great book entitled The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. So, if you really want to overreach, especially overreaching against China, eventually it will be starting the fall rather than starting the rise.